Hello, my name is Graham Brookie, and I'm the Vice President for Technology Programs here at the Atlantic Council, as well as the Senior Director of our Digital Forensic Research Lab. Thank you very much for joining us today for a conversation about the information domain of the Israel-Hamas conflict. Since the attack on October 7, we have observed an information environment both within the conflict and about the conflict that has captured the attention of the world. My thoughts continue to be with those still held hostage and their families, as well as the countless civilians impacted by the ongoing conflict. Our analysis has shown that the information domain within the conflict and the global information environment about the conflict has proven to be a broken and horrifying outlier. We've seen rampant terror propaganda online. We've seen a shocking scale of violent and graphic content depicting or claiming to depict the war. We've seen a dizzying amount of misleading information, and we've seen both localized and global increases in hate speech, including anti-Semitism and Islamophobia online. In today's discussion, we're thankful to be featuring experts on, first, the information domain of this conflict, and second, why what we're seeing online about this conflict is shocking and unique, as well as what can be done about it by social media platforms and many other stakeholders around the world. Today's event would not be possible without the work of our teams here at the DFR Lab and at the Scowcroft Middle East Security Initiative. We'd especially like to thank Charles and Lynn Schusterman Family Philanthropies for their generous support of the Atlantic Council's work. In addition, our team will be releasing a new report called Distortion by Design in the coming days. This report traces how the early stages of the Israel-Hamas war collided with the engineering and policy decisions of platforms like Telegram, Meta, and TikTok. And it draws the attention to policies adopted by Twitter, or what we now call X, that significantly hindered public understanding of this crisis. If you'd like to be a part of today's conversation, we'll be taking question and answer toward the end of each discussion. You can participate by going to askac.org to submit your question and by clicking on the name of this event, Deconstructing the Israel-Hamas Disinfo War. You can also keep up with all of our latest reporting on this conflict, global disinfo campaigns, foreign influence operations, and tech policy at theatlanticcouncil.org and dfrlab.org. I'm turning now to Emerson Brooking, resident senior fellow here at the DFR Lab, who is hosting our first panel on how the fog of war has permeated social media platforms. Over to you, Emerson.
Thank you, Graham. The October 7 Hamas terror attack and subsequent Israeli military operations into Gaza led to more deaths in the first 2 weeks than the entire 4 years of the Second Intifada. All of this death and violence played out on social media, on our smartphones, torn of content from conflict actors, partisans, and digital opportunists. As human beings, the result is pure horror. As researchers of social media and conflict, the result is also an overwhelming challenge. How do we map and understand an information conflict that changes by the hour? How do we make sense of it for the public? How do we make sense of it for ourselves? Fortunately, I'm joined by an incredibly talented panel to try to help make sense of things. I'd like to introduce Alessandro Accorsi, a senior analyst at the International Crisis Group, focused on the intersection of social media and conflict. He was previously head of Middle East-focused research at the European Union External Action Service, focused on foreign interference and information manipulation. Dina Sadek is a Middle East research fellow at the DFR Lab and has helped coordinate our center's coverage of the Israel-Hamas information conflict. She spent many years at the International Republican Institute and helped stand up their disinformation-focused practice there. Dan Bremme is co-founder and CEO of Cyabra, a social threat intelligence and mitigation company, which conducted early and influential studies of social media trends in the aftermath of October 7. And finally, Cheyenne Sahar Dizadeh is a journalist who specializes in investigating online disinformation and conspiracy theories, working for BBC World Service and BBC Monitoring. He is also in the midst of wrapping up day 42 of his widely shared X post series that collects daily misinformation and misinformation trends around the Israel-Hamas war. So once more before we start, final reminder that you can go to ac.org askac.org to submit your questions. And I really do hope to throw this up to as much public input and questions as possible. We're going to go on this panel until about 1:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. And with that being established, Cheyenne, I'd like to turn first to you, just to talk a bit more about, really the origins of your misinformation monitoring effort and what it was like to try to find ground truth on October 7 itself.
Yeah, hello. Happy to be here. Well, the origin of it obviously was that Saturday morning, our time here in the UK, when we woke up early in the morning and we realized basically the attack by Hamas was unfolding. And for most of us here at BBC News, it was a weekend, but then we quickly found out that we had to get to work because something quite major was happening. And what we did immediately afterwards was try and go on social media and try to basically gather as much visual evidence as we could. As the attack was unfolding, obviously it was early morning in Israel and also early morning in Palestinian territories. But then suddenly, as the day went by, we started getting more and more videos from basically Israeli citizens who were basically going outside and filming what was happening on their mobile phones, particularly for the festival side, because there were plenty of people there. Unfortunately, many were killed. Some managed to escape. So the videos started coming in. But then by the time we got to evening, as expected, I was expecting to see misleading information, false videos start to come in, and lo and behold, they did. Precisely the same thing happened on the first day of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Just a couple of hours into the conflict, we started seeing tons and tons of misleading and false videos. At the time, the sort of volume of it was so much that I started putting everything, documenting everything on Twitter, now X. And then it became one of the biggest Twitter threads probably ever compiled. I think by the end of it, I had something like 500, 600, 700 examples in that. It was enormous. So then I started doing the same thing with this one as the videos were coming in. I quickly realized it was going to be, first of all, it was unfortunately not going to be one of those quick conflicts. Obviously, we had the one in 2021 that didn't last that long. This one, from the beginning had the air of something that was going to be a lengthy one. So then I started going, on the usual places that we go to gather information as digital investigators. Twitter, X, Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, Snapchat, YouTube, and basically just sift through all the content that was coming in, which I have to collect and verify as part of my job as a reporter for BBC Verify, when we're trying to put together stories about what was actually happening on the ground. But then at the same time, I was also seeing tons and tons of content that was misleading and false, and then I started putting them together into these Twitter threads that started getting some attention. And I think the reason they got attention was people were seeing these videos, no matter what platform you're on, in this day and age, it's not just on one platform that these videos go viral. As soon as somebody sees it on TikTok, it is posted on X, it is then posted on Instagram, it's then posted on Snapchat. So the reason I think they got quite a bit of attention is that people were seeing these videos. These were not fringe videos. We were talking about millions and millions of views for these videos that I was picking. I didn't have time to go through the stuff that was not getting that much attention. And then, lo and behold, we're on day 42, and it really hasn't slowed down. Like the volume of misinformation hasn't really slowed down. It's pretty much been consistent. I would say what has changed is that we've gone a little more into the information side of it, because in the early couple of weeks, it was mostly like people who were engagement farming. They knew there was so much attention around the world on this conflict. People were going online to see what was going on and looking for videos and updates. So they were putting all sorts of nonsense from past conflicts, old videos, even like video game footage on the internet just to get engagement, and in some cases make money off of it on platforms like YouTube, TikTok, Twitter. But then as we've gone deeper and deeper into the conflict, it's now basically more of a information war going on at the moment, which, even like officials from the Israeli government side have got involved, and, accounts on social media platforms, major platforms that are official accounts of the Israeli government and the IDF. But, as Hamas obviously is banned from most of these platforms, people who are who see themselves as pro-Palestinian, people who see themselves as influencers who want to basically support the Palestinian side, they basically share their own part of the information war. In a way, Hamas obviously does share content on Telegram, but on Telegram, it's different. Many people in the West don't see Telegram, don't go on Telegram, despite the fact that it's a huge platform. So what Hamas puts on Telegram usually gets reposted on other platforms by other people rather than Hamas themselves, who are banned from those platforms. So it's been basically it's been a roller coaster, but I wouldn't say surprising. I wasn't surprised by it, by the volume of it. We saw the exact same thing with the war in Ukraine. We saw the exact same thing during COVID. We saw the exact same thing after the 2020 presidential election in the United States. Basically, we now have to accept that every time a major global event with ramifications that basically travel not just in a particular region, but all around the world and impact everyone around the world. Once something like that happens, you are going to see a torrent of misinformation on the internet.
Thanks, Cheyenne. And quick follow-up, because many of our audience are either journalists, they're open source investigators, or they're enterprising journalists and open source investigators. I think many people in the community have used Twitter for years to track different conflict events. Twitter is now X. How, from just a mechanical perspective, as you're running a thread series that has millions of views, how has that changed now that the platform's so different? And this question is a bit more particular than all the things that have changed on the platform. DFR Lab just wrote 7,000 words about it, but we're nowhere close to hitting everything. But just you functionally, is anything different than it was before?
Well, on X itself, since Elon Musk took over, so many things have changed. Twitter before Elon Musk take over, had a different system of how it operated and responded to misinformation, hate speech. That's changed under Elon Musk, who says, he wants to be more in favor of freedom of speech and just allowing content that is not illegal based on US law to be shared. That I would say there's been I think I'm making an assumption as a journalist. You should not ever make assumptions, but I think I'm safe in making this assumption that after the first week, week 2 of the conflict, I think there was a recognition on X that things were basically getting out of control with the volume of information that was being shared. And obviously what they did at the time was that they sped up the gap in the time between a community note is suggested. Obviously, community notes is the feature within X where other normal users on X basically sign up to be contributors to community notes. So when a post is either false or misleading or requires added context, people will start proposing notes, they write notes, and the other people within the system who've signed up to become community notes contributors start voting. And then, the system works in such a way that, people who have previously disagreed about notes have to, from different sides, have to all agree on it, or a certain percentage of people have to agree on it before it appears on their post. Now, what was going on initially was that, you had a video that had 10 million views that was completely false. It was from Syria, or was from Ukraine, or was from military exercises, or it was a video game footage, and it would take 2 or 3 days. Both his notes would appear under the post. By that point, the 5 million people who had seen the video are not going to go back and see the note, right? It already had the damage was already done. So what they did initially was that they made the process a bit faster, which was good. It was positive. It definitely became faster. And then the second thing that they did was, because the problem wasn't just the misinformation, the problem was that the new changes that have been made to Twitter, particularly with the blue tick system, the now called X Premium, previously Twitter Blue, that you can just pay to get a blue tick next to your name, and then X will boost your content in the algorithm. And then obviously what was later announced by Elon Musk was that, the at-share program, that, if your posts were getting quite a lot of engagement and people were advertising under your post, then Twitter would share its advertising revenue with you. So that gave a massive incentive to people in the early days of the war, and also before the war, to just start posting all sorts of nonsense, rubbish, unevidenced stuff that would get huge engagement, either really shocking, really exciting, really, really outrageous. Just as long as it went up there and you had the blue tick, you could, at the end of the month, make quite a bit of money from that type of content, as long as you were persistently posting and persistently getting huge engagement. So another positive move that they made was that they announced that if your post, even as a blue tick subscriber, if your posts are getting community noted, you're no longer going to be able to make money from it. So I think there's been clearly a recognition that the system that was put in place immediately after Elon Musk took over was basically not a really, really great system, particularly when you have a conflict of this magnitude and of this importance to people around the world.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you. And next, I wanted to turn to Dan. And Dan, to start, if you could describe a bit more just yours and Cyber's work monitoring misinformation narratives and how you refocused after October 7, as well as early observations.
Yep, absolutely. And thanks again for the opportunity. I feel like I'm wearing two hats as we speak. I'm wearing the hat of, Sayabra, the CEO of the company, but I'm also wearing the hat of an Israeli citizen, a husband, and a dad that has been absolutely terrified and just shocked by the events. And so it's very difficult to dance between the two hats and the two events. But I'll tell you what we found. First and foremost, I think it's important to notice the following. The pro-Hamas accounts that we have identified and the pro-Hamas conversations that we have labeled and categorized over time were extremely well coordinated. And it has to be said, this is not something that has been created. If the war started October 7th, we're not talking about an effort that started October 6th. We have found breadcrumbs, social media, instant messaging, and even in some ways, dark web breadcrumbs that were leading people to believe that these efforts were more than a year old. So it's just like when you think about a war and you are building up your logistics and you're building up your inventory and your ammunition, this is exactly the same way that they've done it, right? So you can think of this time, instead of having a weapon, the weapons and the bullets were the social platforms and the words that were being fired at people, towards people, to create confusion and misleading events and pieces of information. And so first and foremost, the coordination and the level of meticulousness at which it has been created. And I'm sure Cheyenne can also talk about that if you guys want, but it has been shocking from our perspective, simply because it was almost at the scale where we didn't believe at first. We thought our counters were wrong. And let me tell you something, even for the first 2-3 days, let's call it the first 2 days of the war itself, they were even more interesting from a social media threat perspective, simply because when we started analyzing the most prominent and the most propagating narratives that we found and the hashtags that we found that 1 account out of 4 on the major social platforms were actually fake. Now, forget about the fact that the ratio itself is, undeniably weird and completely ludicrous. Let's put that aside for a second, right? Let's talk about the fact that these accounts by themselves were able to create within 2 days. And again, Shine spoke about that, a few minutes ago. The amount of volume. So when information operations is being done and conducted properly, it is actually not just a game and not just a war of quantity. It's a game of quality. Because sure, maybe it's only 1 account out of 4 that were fake, but actually they were creating and generating close to 500 million views just by themselves. And no, we haven't been able to analyze the entire internet and the entire social media platforms. This is only based on what our fishing rod has found. Do you realize what I'm telling you? Like, we just looked at the main hashtags, the flood Al-Aqsa and the flood Jerusalem and the flood whatever name you can think of the kibbutz and the villages that were really next to the Gaza Strip. it was almost like an indication from the physical war to the digital war, almost like that, right? And you could see that, and you could see accounts that were by themselves in 2 days tweeting almost 700 times, and before the war, a couple of hours before that, they were silent. Some of them had blue ticks, and some of them didn't. But it doesn't matter because one account was able to tweet 700 times in 2 days and generate hundreds of thousands of views. This is, folks, this is one account, and they were publishing propaganda posts and trying to create legitimacy about the acts and to create a perspective of it is actually okay that we kidnap people because we're doing that from a self-defense perspective. But the truth is, it's very hard to create legitimacy about kidnapping, babies, children, women, men, elderly. I mean, it's very hard to create that. And yet, while in the real world, while I'm sure that the majority of people listening to this are saying, of course, it makes no sense to create legitimacy. There's a lot of people that were exposed to this content in real time, hundreds of millions of views, and it convinced some of these people. Lo and behold, it did. And you can see the aftermath of these first 2 days and the one account out of 4. And by the way, we're speaking mostly about X, which is formerly known as Twitter, and also TikTok. And you know why? This is really interesting. Forget about the trust and safety gaps and cracks that there are within the platforms themselves. This is not me bashing about anyone. What's interesting to me is about the nature of this war, which has turned into a visual machine, right? There's been a lot of what we call DIP, which is deceptive imagery persuasion. So it's creating new content, like Cheyenne was saying before. It's recycling content from 2016, 2013. It is generating pictures of kids with blood, but 6 fingers. And most people don't know that. Most people are not counting the fingers on their hands, and yet it is working very well. Mm-hmm. So a lot of that technique around, visual deception and narrative deception and confusion has been something that we have seen so far that has worked extremely well. And unfortunately, it's the 42nd day of war, like Chan said earlier, and no, we haven't seen any slowdown. We've seen a lot of changes in narratives, a lot of different angles. Before the entrance into the Gaza Strip, after it just turned into something else. So this is what we found. It's worrying because from a tech company that also has looked at, really deeply into election meddling, election interference locally and internationally, looking at other conflicts, unfortunate conflicts like the Ukraine-Russia one as well, and even the release of movies. We are seeing that the strength and the speed at which things have happened in this war has been almost unprecedented.
Absolutely. And Dan, I did have a quick follow-up here because our DFR lab, for instance, looked a lot at potential Russian information planning before the invasion of Ukraine. And the question, the extent to which an actor sort of pre-positions information assets or has distribution networks ready to go, this is becoming more and more common as we think about information conflict. I just wanted to clarify and get a few more thoughts of yours on this topic. Do you think that many you identified in this pro-Hamas amplification network, that they were acting having anticipated the attack, or rather was this sort of an opportunistic amplification network that had already been put in place?
So this is not just a gut feeling. This is a data-based feeling, what I'm about to say, which is I am 99% confident when I say that this has been planned ahead, because you can see that they were able to create siloed conversations and small communities that had a lot of impact over people that were not necessarily educated about the conflict, about the geopolitical tension, because it is a conflict region. It is a complex region, right? And so we were seeing communities that were targeted way before. How do we know that? Because when you look at some of those very early hashtags or some of those very early accounts that almost did nothing for a year and a half and then suddenly pop up as if you pressed a button and started getting reactivated, you could clearly see that these accounts started spreading and dripping. And it's a really well-known technique of information operations. They were dripping little thoughts, dripping content, dripping links, and even some of those very early Telegram sparks for the early days were actually channels that were not created October 7th. They were created way before that. And you'd be surprised. Yes, it was on Telegram, but it was also on private messages on Instagram, talking to influencers and making sure that when something happens, if potentially something happens, they would be the first one to get it. But you could also see that in some places where the media had an in some ways or some sort. And in some ways, the media might have been influenced by the pre-existing, predefined relationships that they have with some of the folks that were part of the event. And so it was really hard to create an objective point of view, right? Even within those early days. So to me, there is absolutely no doubt that this was premeditated, well orchestrated, and we're seeing the fruits of it today for the last 42 days.
Well, thank you, Dan. Dina, I'd like to turn next to you. As I mentioned earlier, you've helped run DFR Lab's own monitoring efforts over this first 42 days. And I'd love if you just shared some of your observations about the course of the information conflict. And I'll note in particular, you published early work focused specifically on Telegram channel distributions.
Thank you, Emerson. Hello, everyone. Thank you, Emerson, for moderating this panel and for the organizers for putting this together and inviting us to share our perspectives. So in terms of what has stood out to me the most has been reiterated by the other panelists already. There's the sheer volume of content out there, which makes it hard to keep up with. But the sheer volume of content that includes misleading and disinformation content is also coupled with a significant amount of confirmation bias. And in such information landscape, false and misleading information can easily go viral, and factual information ends up becoming diluted when it's just shared in a virtual game of telephone. So what does this mean in terms of what we have seen so far? Around just for 40 days since the Hamas attack, the landscape remains full of misinformation and disinformation and unverified information. But in the beginning, some of it was more of reaction, partially attributed to overall confusion early on with how the attack took place and who is involved in the immediate aftermath. And now the information landscape is more flooded with misinformation and misleading content about specific events, like what took place, for example, at the hospital blast, and content of different variety resonates with people online, or they go and seek it online based on confirmation bias about a long-term conflict. So that leads to speculations online about everything under the sun that Cheyenne is working very tirelessly to make sure to verify some of those claims among other fact checkers as well around the world. But the information is anything under the sun, from the number of people that are being injured or killed to whether certain events took place at all. And that continues to contribute to a state of confusion. When it comes to Telegram, that has been and continues to be a very strong PR machine for Hamas, as evidenced by both the significant increase to subscribers to Hamas's Telegram channel since the attack, and their boost in view per post numbers that we have reported in our initial research about the overall information landscape. But also the second thing is the fact that we are seeing a lot of the content from these channels traveling to other platforms, and of which there is a lot. Which makes it even harder to track the sources and authenticity of this content. In terms of the ban that just occurred recently on Hamas's channels on Apple and Google devices, that certainly helps reduces exposure to some of that propaganda content somewhat, but a lot of people can still access it on other devices, and I can get it right now. I can get those channels on my desktop version, making it that those channels are not really effectively banned. That content is still available out there, and we are going to still see it on other platforms. Hamas was already preparing for that possibility by launching their own apps. So that type of content will still play out, and it will still continue to be disseminated through those channels and other smaller channels. But the significant amount of that content itself, it just makes it harder to keep up with and outpaces verification efforts. Even if Cheyenne does one thread every single day, there's still a lot out there from those Telegram channels and other many sources that needs to be verified and checked.
Oh, thanks, Dina. And as a quick follow-up, we're talking here about social media, digital media, specific social media platforms. But you in particular have a background that extends well beyond digital media, right? You've worked with entire media ecosystems in both Middle East and across Asia Pacific. So I was curious just if you had thoughts on the broader media landscape. Do you think most people today following the conflict, basically, how much are they getting from their smartphones versus maybe mediated by television, by newspapers, by traditional media, where it's reporters who are the ones who are plugged into X and Telegram all day? But any thoughts you have to share there?
So but reporters post that content on social media. For many people around the world, that is kind of the first line of where to get information, and then you click on the links of the media outlets articles from there in order to get to them. So I can't speak to specific differences between specific countries unless you know I have more information about the specific countries comparison, but overall comparison between regions, that still continues to be the same. That people rush to social media first before they go to other media sources.
Well, thank you, Dina. And finally, Alessandro, I wanted to turn to you because you have extensive experience in both studying modern information conflict, but then also in the longer history of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. What elements make this current conflict different, do you think? Is there something qualitatively new going on, especially in the information space, or is this another iteration of phenomena that you've studied before?
First of all, thanks for the invitation to join this panel. This particular conflict has been fought on the digital space for a long time, at least since the beginning of the 2000s. In 2008, during Operation Cast Lead, the IDF opened a YouTube channel 3 days into the operation, and Hamas conducted a series of hacking operations against Israeli websites, media channels, and others. I think the most useful comparison in a way between this conflict and previous iterations of it is the 2014 war in Gaza, because it's a conflict that in a way started similarly on the wave of an emotional reaction to the kidnapping of 3 Israeli teens in Hebron. Obviously, it's not comparable in terms of magnitude, but it started as an emotional response to this event. Hamas really tried to mobilize social media and use social media and digital media to boast their victory in this instance, and then in the attacks against like the rocket attacks among its supporters, and it's more localized. Their target audience is way more localized, and they try to boast it for the supporters and against basically Fatah. Israel tried to mobilize support to have enough support for the ongoing military operations, but eventually, in a way, it's widely regarded as a PR victory for the Palestinian International Solidarity Movement that was able to mobilize and use effectively, in a way, the documentation of violence taking place in Gaza, the images coming from Palestinian citizen journalists that were circulating on social media and reached millions of people worldwide. And eventually, this managed to turn the tide of public opinion, short of a ground invasion, after slightly more than 2,200 Palestinian casualties and around 70 Israeli casualties. Now, this is not comparable in terms of scale, obviously, but today is completely different. Today is very, very different. And I think it's the perfect storm of disinformation and misinformation for many reasons. I will just highlight three main differences. The first one is that our relationship to social media is different. This is not anymore one of the first social media wars. 2014 could contend that with the Syrian civil war, or 2012 war in Gaza. We have a different relationship to social media. We're both more accustomed to social media as a resource. We're more used to open source intelligence investigations, social media being used as a resource to plan humanitarian response, to conduct media investigations, all this kind of stuff. And at the same time, we're also more distrustful towards social media. We've been exposed to disinformation, to major scandals. So the way we approach social media is different. And the way misinformation and disinformation has an effect on public opinion is also different. It's not so much used anymore to win new hearts and minds, but it fuels polarization, it fuels confirmation biases, it radicalizes positions and creates silos between communities that refuse to understand each other and look at evidence that is presented from the other side. The other thing that is different in our relationship to social media is that we internalize somehow some of the social media logics, the fast times of reaction, the engagement logic, and we can see that even policymakers in a way are rage baiting in some cases, or rushing to get to conclusions and engage with their communities rather than take time to reflect. But the same, some of the things we grew accustomed to, like OSINT and fact checking, is being effectively weaponized also to divide communities and to control the information flow. The second thing that is different is that social media is not a good place. We've said plenty about it already, but X is completely broken. It's incentivizing emotional responses and rage baiting over accurate information. Telegram is completely unmoderated, and Meta and TikTok have a fundamental moderation transparency problem. They rely heavily on AI to moderate their content, but they're not transparent about the measures they're taking, and there's less trust in them, and we don't know what's really happening. So the safeguards that were in place before in previous conflicts are now gone. There are no safeguards in place. And the third element I think is very different compared to previous conflicts is that the images of the 7 October attacks are new and are shocking. In previous iterations of this conflict, we grew accustomed in a way to the images of Palestinian violence on Palestinians in Gaza, for example. They were a fixture of those conflicts. The images coming out of 7 October were shocking and were unprecedented. The international public was not exposed to violence on Israeli civilians since the Second Intifada, at least, and never was exposed to violence on Israeli civilians in this scale. This was the largest attack on Israel in a single day. What that meant was that this was a conflict that, in a way, was always asymmetrical for different reasons, but in a way was played fair. It had certain rules. Hamas was highly coordinated with their allies, but on more shadowy channels that they could use. Israel had a high level of coordination and more resources. For example, they could, in this instance, Israel has published more than 70 ads on YouTube, sometimes using the graphic images that circulated from the 7 October attacks. And the international solidarity movement was less coordinated, but it had a powerful narrative, and it had the power of the imagery of the violence against Palestinians. When this was not anymore the case, when the rules were broken and there were no rules anymore to this game and everything got confused, everyone started playing dirty. And you started seeing more and more the use of whataboutism, especially since the military operations in Gaza started, but especially after the Al-Hali attack. You saw like the use of whataboutism, the use of look at my victims, but forget about the other ones, the crisis actors. The other side is exaggerating or lying about the number of victims. The dehumanizing narratives to try and separate facts and try to see this conflict as two silos that do not speak to each other, but also to try and shield our own opinion, like try to reinforce the confirmation biases and shield them from information that might be coming from the other side, and try to prevent, to justify what was happening in a way or another preventively. And what this actually meant in a way is that it reduced the incentives to de-escalate violence, and it made, in a way, ineffective a strategy that could have played out in previous instances of this conflict of, well, let's wait till the death toll is high enough for public opinion to actually put pressure. And this has not happened so far, despite the largest number of toll in any of the previous recent iterations of this conflict.
Well, thank you, Alessandro, for that excellent overview. I now want to start turning to audience questions. And as a reminder, you can go to askac.org to submit your own question. I want to start back with you, Cheyenne, because we have a question from Eleni regarding a specific piece of misinformation that you've covered over the past few days, which purportedly showed a woman talking about claiming to be a nurse of Shifa Hospital, then under siege. I mean, you could explain it better, but she claimed to have been under pressure by Hamas. The video was pretty obviously orchestrated. The sound effects appeared fake. But then there have been accusations in a hate campaign against an unrelated Israeli actress whom the online mobs claim to have been in the video. But I was hoping you could talk a bit about just your experience investigating that particular claim, or broader lessons that we can draw from this example.
Yeah, that's a really interesting example because, first of all, I think most people have seen it. Look, it was so viral, and it still is, frankly, that most people know exactly what video we're talking about. It took us, like me and my colleague Olga Robinson, we usually do these fact checks together at BBC Verify. It took us like a bit of time to be able to, most of the times with these types of videos, what we want to do first of all is source the video. So we want to find out original platform where this piece of video emerged from, who was basically the person who posted it first, and then you want to get in touch with them, or through sort of searches on the internet, you want to find out more about that person or that entity or that group that posted this video. What was the full context? What was the date when it was posted? Is it old? Is it new? If it's current, where exactly it was filmed? Who's in it? All those questions you want to be able to answer. With this one, obviously, with our Shifa Hospital being at the center of this conflict in the last couple of weeks, it was obviously difficult. But obviously, we have BBC is one of the sort of news outlets that does have reporters in Gaza on the ground. As difficult as it is for journalists to get into Gaza, but luckily we have a couple of reporters there. So then contact the people inside the hospital, see whether they've seen this nurse, they know who this nurse is. Does she look familiar in the video? Obviously, she has a sort of mask kind of half on, like you can see her mouth as she speaks, but the mask is not fully on, so you can actually recognize the face. And then obviously the other aspect of it, which came to attention online, was the fact that although she speaks in English, the way she speaks is not normally the way people who are Palestinian or people who are in Gaza sound like when they speak English. But she also speaks a bit of Arabic at the end of the video. Again, it doesn't, we spoke to people who are actual Palestinians who recognize the language, recognize the dialect in Gaza, and they said it didn't sound like it. And then as you know, the sort of sound of explosions that you hear in the background of the video completely look edited in. We're all, despite the fact that we weren't able to sort of look at, I don't think anyone has been able to source that video, where exactly it came from. No one has so far. I'm still, today I was working on that before I joined this call, still sort of searching, contacting people to try and figure out who the source of that video is. But those elements were already good enough for us to say with some degree of certainty that that video was fake. Now, the full context of it, was it a satirical piece that was created at some point? Was it recent? Was it old? We don't know all of those at the moment. We're still investigating. But one of the reasons that's a really good example is not only did it go really viral, but it was actually pushed by some official Israeli government accounts as well. Some of them deleted them, some haven't, but it was also pushed officially by the Israeli government, some people within the Israeli government. But then the other aspect of it is some people who view themselves as sort of digital online sleuths on the pro-Palestinian side then went on and tried to sort of identify this woman in the video, and they got hold of a young mother, Mexican Israeli mother who lives in Israel with her partner and her little child, and they sort of doxed her online, and she received, she showed me like a ton of abuse, anti-Semitic abuse, really nasty abuse that she'd suffered, despite the fact that if you just go, this individual has, is a social media influencer. She's active on Instagram, she's active on YouTube, she's got a huge online footprint. You can go look at her videos. I was on the phone with her just 2 days ago. She sounded nothing like the supposed nurse in that video. Her English was completely different. She spoke good English, but her English was completely different to what we hear in the video. But it's really like, and then those doxing attempts also went viral, just like the video itself. The doxing attempts went really viral on X, actually, under some of these original videos of tweets containing the video. A false community note started appearing saying that, well, that woman who is in the video is actually the Mexican Israeli one. Well, she wasn't. But that's when we talk about the fog of war, this is a great example of it. That on both sides, in both directions, it actually fooled and misled a lot of people. And even as we speak, nearly 5 days since that video started appearing online, and I think the first instance of it that I've been able to look at was on TikTok, not on X or on Instagram. But even that TikTok video, I don't think is the original copy. And we're still looking for the original copy. Who made this video in what context? But it just is a good example of just how complicated this stuff is. And sometimes after days and days of trying to investigate we still don't have a clear answer as to where that video comes from. We are pretty confident that the video itself is not an actual nurse in our Shifa hospital, and we're also quite confident that that Israeli woman who was doxxed online is not the woman in the video.
Well, thank you, Cheyenne. And it comes as a surprise to me and perhaps many viewers that X's community notes function was actually instrumentalized in that doxing campaign. I've been unaware of that.
It was actually, unfortunately, sort of that community note, after sort of we started reporting that woman is not her at all, and some journalists started contacting her and talking to her and sort of looking. These days you can't actually put two faces next to each other. There are facial recognition tools available that you can use. Once we start saying that, thankfully the community note was voted down. Initially it appeared on like those videos, and people would look at it and go, there it is, she's the one. And as I say, unfortunately, particularly on her Instagram account, she suffered a wave of horrific abuse.
So I want to turn next to a series of questions from Albert Lee of Korea Pro, which are all excellent. But I'll present three and then see if panelists could address which parts they're most comfortable with. First, Albert asks about the difficulty in studying information conflict when so much activity takes place on encrypted platforms beyond easy monitoring. How do we accommodate that? Second, Albert asks about the growing danger of desensitization to graphic content. The sheer availability of graphic content and imagery out of this war, the ways that it's been used by essentially every conflict actor, including, for instance, the Israeli government making widely available a supercut of the massacres that have been initially recorded by either dash cams or Hamas GoPros. And then finally, your assessments of the role of generative AI in this mis and disinformation around the conflict. Those are several related questions. Please address what makes most sense to you, but I want to turn next to Dan.
Yeah, I would be happy to actually start talking about maybe the last question, the use and employment of Gen AI as a technology in this war. And I'll say something that might sound wildly unpopular, but for this conflict, we have seen actually less Gen AI than I would have expected. And I believe that the reason for that is very simple. The use of Gen AI comes when you're trying to simplify the access, the accessibility, and the ease at which you can start generating content for different purposes. In that war, like we all kind of agree at this point, in that war, there wasn't any lack of content. On the contrary, there was a flood of content. There was a flood of content. Some of it was recycled. Some of it was real. Some of it was, sort of screenshotted pictures and single frames from longer videos for the sake of repurposing some of those narratives into other narratives. But I wouldn't say that Gen AI was a big usage. I mean, I can probably think of maybe just a few examples, and nothing more than that. And that is, to me, surprising, but also very logical, because the content and the narratives were so harsh and so rough for people to, and sorry for the use of term, to play with on social media, that it actually created the highest level of dopamine that you could have hoped for. So no need to generate things when you have the reality for you.
Well, thank you, Dan. And if you're willing, the question regarding desensitization to graphic material, the Israeli government has understandably made it part of its messaging strategy, but I am curious for your thoughts about that danger of desensitization or even diminishing persuasive power of these images, just as the horror continues to accumulate.
Yeah. I actually think that the impact of showcasing and exposing very senior press members worldwide to what actually happened on October 7th and 8th is something was of a unheard of magnitude. And it's probably really hard for people to grasp. The good thing, there's nothing good about it, but I'll say it as it is. The good thing about the impact is that it's very hard to deny what you see when it's coming from a body cam or a GoPro or a smartphone. The bad thing about it is that it's almost ungraspable and indigestible, to the point that I do know that some folks that even were exposed to this type of content, their coping mechanism, their own genuine defense mechanism, was to not believe, because it's so hard to grasp it and to genuinely digest that, which a normal human being shouldn't, to be honest with you. But I'll say one small footnote that most people don't know, and unfortunately we would have known as Sayabra, of course, and we do know. The majority of the content that was shown to the press, right, the so-called video, the famous one, is actually only showing some of the horrific things, and the terrible things that were exposed were actually what we call the after action. So, and I don't want to give too many details, but imagine that you wouldn't see the act, you would see the blood, you would see the blood and the bodies and the and terrible things like that. But on the other hand, there are other videos, and it ties back to your first question. There are other videos that were flooded within, I'd say, a few dozens of very large groups on Telegram, WhatsApp, and even Facebook groups that were showing the act and the aftermath. And those videos are, while they're not accessible for everyone, they're definitely too harsh for people to comprehend.
Well, thank you for sharing your perspective, Dan. Dina, I wanted to turn next to you on the 3 questions I outlined, in particular, the challenges of encrypted research methods, but also note on the issue of desensitization to imagery that it's not just the Israeli government's use of this material. It is the flood of material from sometimes Hamas partisans, but from also the much broader pro-Palestinian diaspora. So if you're willing to speak to that component too, we'd welcome your thoughts.
Yeah, sure. I'm happy to speak to that as it relates to research. I think a lot of this footage that's available online. It helps with a lot of the research in terms of eventually holding perpetrators of violence accountable and verifying whether events happen or not. I'm not entirely sure if sharing them on social media platforms is the best way to do them, or if average social media users should be seeing such graphic footage because of the impact first and foremost on the mental health of the viewers. But I will say that the existence of the content sometimes helps in bringing justice to in instances like this. When it comes to doing the research on encrypted platforms, luckily in this particular time, the research that we have been doing has been on groups that are easily available. You can type them easily on your cell phone and get access to all the information that they've been posting. So it is that kind of had made things easier, but the difficulty of it in the beginning is finding those groups at all. So once the groups get viral enough or are popular enough that people are going to them as trusted sources of information or sources of information at all, that's when it becomes more known to researchers, and it becomes more difficult to verify that content that's spreading on those encrypted platforms, because a lot of the times you don't know the source of it and who is presenting that content. I can think of an example where even if incidents are happening in places where you can confirm authenticity, like Cheyenne the other day enlisted the help of the good people of New York just to verify the authenticity of a billboard. So when we're seeing, we're sifting through not just tens, not just hundreds, thousands and thousands of daily footage and all these Telegram groups. The easiest part is finding them. The hardest part is really sifting through all the content that's available in them, and some of the groups that we might not even know about. And as I mentioned earlier, just as Hamas was preparing for potentially their channels being banned, it's not just Hamas's channels that are important. There are a wide variety of other smaller groups. Some of them we are aware of them, and some of them we might not still be aware of them, because it has been 42 days and there's a lot of new groups and a lot of accounts that are still coming out, included in those encrypted platforms.
Well, thank you, Dina. And Alessandro, I'll turn to you for the last word. We've had also some late-breaking questions from May and others about the issue of attributing inauthentic content when the content may be authentic. And just even as researchers, sometimes we might risk drowning or altering perspectives around sincere political expression. But I welcome your thoughts on any of the questions raised, and you have about 2 minutes to do it.
All right, I'll try to tie everything together. I perfectly agree with Dan on generative AI and the fact that there was no lack of content, so we didn't really have to have much of it. The examples of generative AI that we've seen are pretty blatantly fake. And I think it was done on purpose. I think it was to actually say, this is AI generated. Look at what else could be AI generated. Do not trust any of the images that are coming from the ground. And that happened for both images. For example, the images that were posted by the Israeli Prime Minister's account of the babies, but also for images coming from Gaza. In a way, like, the visual element of this conflict has been really important. And there's something new in the way OSINT, fact-checking, community notes, all these kind of things have been weaponized to serve misinformation. There are there have been, and this makes it like, for example, like when there is a major accident like the Al-Hali blast, we still don't know exactly what happened, but there's so much information that is circulating, and OSINT and digital investigation require time to acquire videos, to go through them, to verify them, and then to make the analysis. And at the same time, everyone already had an answer because they had their own confirmation biases, but there were also a ton of fake OSINT accounts. I call them influencers, people who have a rage baiting approach to the distribution of information. They are not using social media to distribute information with the purpose of informing the public, but rather to for political gains or for economic gains and monetizing engagement on their content. And we've seen this type of accounts spreading, and that makes it even more complicated to actually go through everything that we know that is true and not. I've been working with my colleagues who are excellent in Crisis Group to also like go through different accounts of things that happened to understand whether they're real or not. And in most cases, they're very much real, but spun in a way that is serving one narrative. Because as we know, all the best lies have a part of truth. And that is something that has been very concerning about this conflict, because it's in a way, it's actually diffusing one of the best tools that came out of social media, which is the digital investigations and OSINT.
Well, thank you for that, Alessandro. And thanks very much to this entire panel, Cheyenne, Dan, Dina, and Alessandro, for joining us for this critical conversation. I'm going to turn now to our second panel, specifically on tech policy interventions, noting that we've received many questions about tech policy interventions. So if you are staying on, please ask your question again. But to introduce as moderator for this session, I'm pleased to introduce Elizabeth Dwoskin, who's Silicon Valley correspondent for the Washington Post. And Elizabeth, over to you.
Emerson, thank you so much for having me moderate this panel. I've been on the front lines of covering some of these issues since the war broke out, and also the conflict is very personal to me as well. So I'm grateful to be here and to talk with such smart experts on these subjects as they happen in real time. So first, everyone already knows Emerson, no introduction, but I'd like to introduce Julia Wono. She's a member of the Meta Oversight Board, formerly the Facebook Oversight Board. That means she's, as most folks here know, she doesn't work for Meta. She's not a Meta representative. And the director of Internet Sans Frontières, a civil society organization that's advocated for digital freedoms and rights since 2007. And I would like to introduce Olga. Please don't, I hope I don't butcher your last name, Olga. Olga Belogolova, director of the Emerging Technologies Initiative at Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies, and a former senior manager at Facebook, Meta, focused on disrupting influence operations. And she also ran threat response during the the ongoing Russia-Ukraine war. So I'm excited to dive in. I think my first question is for all three of you, which is just to say, we've seen Russia-Ukraine, and there was a smaller Israel-Hamas war in 2021. How does this crisis compare in terms of how the platforms are responding, and what are the different issues that are coming up for platforms? And Olga, why don't you go ahead and start? Because obviously you were on the front lines of actually addressing this for a long time.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. I'm glad that this conversation is taking place, and I'm thankful to be a part of it. I, wanted to also clear up that, it's always important to give credit to all the people that do this work. There were so many people that worked on the front lines of responding in Ukraine, and so I just want to give credit to a lot of the different people that do that work. And so getting back to the question itself, there's a number of problems that you encounter during a time of crisis at a social media company. And in particular, What I would say, the difference is that you might see here is that there are just more trust and safety problems to deal with. To put it very succinctly, because normally during a crisis event, during a time of conflict, you might have some challenges around the information environment, things like dealing with misinformed individuals, sharing false information, threat actors from different nation states and non-nation state actors engaging in running influence campaigns, cyber espionage activity, as well as hate speech, incitement to violence and harassment. But the additional layer here is that you also have terrorist and content. And so you're dealing with a dangerous organizations problem in addition to dealing with all these other slew of challenges. And the other thing that, if we're doing a sort of side-by-side comparison with the conflict in Ukraine that is still, of course, ongoing, then you will, also have to make a comparison between the sort of global nature of interest that exists when it comes to issues related to Israel and Hamas. And of course, there's a lot of people around the world were interested in Ukraine. But as you mentioned at the outset, a lot of these issues touch people personally, which means that the conflict itself that happens online spills over into other spaces where the hate speech isn't just in region, but it's also exhibited in people's personal social media platforms, probably more so than you might have imagined when the war first broke out in Ukraine.
That's a really, really interesting observation. The last one, I'll definitely we'll go back to that. Julie, tell me what you think.
First of all, thank you so much for organizing this I would say much needed discussion for us to take stock of what has happened in the past month, and also probably envision a way forward. I couldn't agree more with what you just said, Olga, about the types of I don't almost want to say specificities of the current conflict, and particularly one aspect that you touched upon, which is the dangerous organizations that is being involved, the dangerous organizations policies, especially at Meta, Facebook, and Instagram specifically, that are being involved with this case, and with the fact that Hamas is one of the protagonists. I would like to share with the audience a series of information that we haven't shared yet publicly about the type of appeals we've been receiving so far at the Oversight Board when it comes to the current conflict. So I have to say that there's been an uptick of nearly 1,000% in the number of appeals that have been filed with the Oversight Board. As a reminder, for those who don't know, the Oversight Board receives appeals either from users. So if you're a user, your content has been taken down, or you're a user and you don't agree with something that you see, or you don't agree that something that you see should be on the platform because it violates the community standards, you can appeal to the board. And there's another conduit through which we receive cases, and that conduit is through the company itself, Meta, when Meta is struggling to apply its own policies. So far, we have seen an increase of, as I was saying, close to 2,000% in terms of appeals. The majority of those appeals do indeed concern Meta's dangerous organizations and individuals' policy. But we're also seeing a significant reporting around violence and incitement, as well as the hate speech policy. The kinds of appeal typically vary, but they include on-the-ground footage of the ongoing crisis, news reports, edited educational videos, blanket statements of support for Israel or Palestine or Hamas. We've also received cases that relate to the current conflict, but from countries all around the world in various languages. I mean, this speaks to the specificity maybe of this conflict between Israel and Hamas. And some of the themes that I wanted to share, which are of interest for the Oversight Board, are how is a company like Meta treating journalism from the region? because we find often that reporters who cover dangerous organizations, or at least organizations considered dangerous by Meta's policies, well, those journalists get arbitrarily censored by Meta because they merely mention, well, the subject of their coverage, which is a dangerous organization. So we're very interested in exploring that with the different cases that we're looking at. We also are interested in digging deeper into how Meta should preserve content that documents human rights abuses. We've talked about that in some of our decisions, including a decision that we made earlier this year in a case relating to the conflict in the Nagorno-Karabakh between Azerbaijan and Armenia. And we think this can be extremely important for investigations, especially investigations that for violations of international humanitarian law. And last but not least, an area of interest for the board with regards to conflicts in general, and this one specifically, is around sensitive issues like, the hospital bombing and the hostage situation. So we are currently, our case selection committee is currently reviewing cases related to conflict as part of our selection process. For those who don't know, we do select cases. We can take all the appeals, unfortunately, but we try to be very strategic in the appeals that we select, and that's the task that our content and case selection committee is currently working on. Thank you.
Well, actually, before we go to Emerson, I want to follow up on that. So you said that you have gotten 1,000% uptick in appeal.
2,000.
2,000%.
Yeah, 2,000. Sorry about that.
Oh, and you said, and I just want to make sure that we all heard you correctly. You said that the majority of those were related to dangerous organizations, and say what you said. You said the majority of those are dangerous organizations.
Most of the cases, of the appeal filed concern the dangerous organizations policy, but also we have a very good group of violence and incitement appeals. Appeals about the violence and incitement policy, and appeals about the hate speech policy.
So it's people who are coming to you and saying, hey, I mentioned this dangerous group, in this case Hamas, in my post, and my content got taken down. I don't think it's fair for any number of reasons. Is that basically?
It could be that. It could also be that you think an organization should not be mentioned on the platform, because we do take appeals for content that is being left up on the platform. So it could be that indeed your content has been taken down because you've mentioned a dangerous organization. We've received many cases about that, specifically about the Taliban. But it could also be that you could disagree that an organization is being mentioned on the platform. So yeah, we have a variety of appeals regarding that policy.
Yeah, this one is obviously very nuanced, because I think, going back to what Olga said, is you have the platforms, at least Meta, YouTube, and X in theory, ban an outward praising of a terrorist organization or a dangerous group. However, there are all sorts of people celebrating or giving support to what's to the Palestinian cause, and that line has always been extremely hard for tech companies to draw.
Absolutely. No, absolutely. We haven't worked on a case that specifically speaks to what you're saying. So that is individuals praising or expressing their support for the Palestinian cause, and that being associated with a dangerous organization. We have not received so far, or at least we have not worked so far on a case that relates to that issue specifically. We've already, though, made a decision about Israel and Palestine as early as 2021, a decision in which we were dealing with a news reporting. In that case, it was a reporting by Al Jazeera, who had, shared information about a militia, a Palestinian militia, warning of potential, firing missiles against the Israeli government, or at least in Israeli territories. And the content was reshared by a user who was located in Egypt. Again, we find the very international aspect of this conflict here. So a user in Egypt reshared the publication by Al Jazeera, simply saying, I think that the user was saying, oh, or something like that, nothing more. Unfortunately, that content was taken down. The board reversed Facebook, because it was a post on Facebook decision, and requested, we can do that. We can request the content to be put back up. That's the binding part of our decisions, because our decisions are binding, and we can also make policy recommendations. And so in that specific case, we asked the company to put the content back up. And in addition to that, we made a series of recommendations to which the company must respond. One of those recommendations is that we ask to Facebook, Meta, to commission an audit of its moderation infrastructure and identify potential bias against Hebrew or Arabic content. And that audit was conducted for the first time ever by an organization called BSR, which published in 2022 its findings, in which both Meta and BSR acknowledged that there were serious bias against Arabic content on Meta's content moderation infrastructure and on its different platforms, Facebook and Instagram specifically. So I'll stop there for that, but just to say that we've already worked on a case that relates to Israel and Palestine.
Are you, Emerson, maybe you could take this. I know in 2021, there was an issue where in the 2021 war where people were talking on Instagram and Facebook on Meta's platforms about, they were using the term Al-Aqsa, the mosque, because at the time Israel had actually stormed the mosque. And yet there is a term Al-Aqsa that also, there's an Al-Aqsa terrorist brigade that's considered a dangerous group. And so because of a glitch, they called it a glitch, lots of content just protesting what was happening at the mosque got taken down. I'm wondering if you're seeing anything like that this time, Emerson, on any platform.
Unfortunately, we see instances of this across platforms. I would note of the Al-Aqsa episode in 2021 especially stood out because, of course, Aqsa is in the Quran. It's one of the holiest sites in Islam. The fact that it had a blanket word filter was a remarkable demonstration of, I think, being out of touch with users in the region. That, of course, not always due to specific trust and safety decisions, but also due to much more deep-seated issues. The fact that machine learning around different language detection, machine learning data sets, many of them, in fact, emerged from US industries that were focused on the war on terror. Essentially, our entire use of automated processes, which has its roots in the global war on terror, then was more than essentially 2 decades later having these carry-on effects. We have seen some cases where that's continued in this conflict. Notably, there was a glitch where I believe Instagram appended the word terrorist to some profiles. To Meta's credit, they did acknowledge that error and they apologized for it. But more broadly, as we've conducted research across different technology platforms, many Palestinian users approach social media with the expectation that they will be censored, that from the start they have to be almost adversarial or evasive in order to communicate their point of view. So an increasing use, not just on Meta platforms, but also on TikTok of phenomena like algo speak, where you use different words, unrelated words to describe particular concepts, which you know might be automatically filtered. And then also because now users expect to be censored, we see numerous cases where users are alleging that they've been censored or filtered when in fact they have not been. It's a kind of echo of the widespread shadow banning claims that you saw, say, on the far right for partisans of President Trump a few years ago. So it's this strange mix of actual platform interventions that serve to limit some political expression, along with this less and less trust among users themselves. But I did want to make another point here, which was just thinking broadly about Russia-Ukraine versus this crisis. The Russian invasion of Ukraine was an attack by one state upon another, which saw Russian tanks rolling through Kharkiv, scenes reminiscent of the Second World War. It was a traditional conflict, one state belligerent against another. And from a technology policy perspective, although it was extremely difficult to come up in real time with wartime content moderation decisions, it was also clear that Russia was instrumentalizing its media to help affect violence against Ukrainian civilians, that Ukrainian civilians needed to be protected, especially because they were users of these platforms. And also I should note, the Russian government itself had many reasons to distance its population from Western social media services. So those were the elements at play last year. This year, by contrast, you have a terror attack orchestrated by Hamas. Hamas is a governing body for part of, but not all, of the state that the majority of the United Nations recognizes as Palestine. And then you also have a much broader pro-Palestinian diaspora and pro-Palestinian political activist groups in numerous nations who are each trying to express their own support for Palestinian people without praising Hamas terrorism. And so as a consequence, in this war, unlike in 2022, I think issues of political expression are so much more inextricably linked to these social media services, because there are not two clear sides which can be easily disentangled by anyone, certainly not by policymakers and technology companies.
Olga, Julie, feel free to respond.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, I think, there's definitely a challenge when responding in a situation like this. But, I think we've covered a lot of topics already in this conversation. It's important to note that there, often with these different content moderation decisions or things that occur, you have to be mindful of the fact that some of the time that is not necessarily a decision made of malintent, right? There's a lot of people working to prioritize how to handle issues during a time of conflict. And issues that once you bring to someone who isn't working on them directly, they also probably wouldn't know how to deal with them themselves. And so, you're having, I described a few specific problems that trust and safety teams have to deal with. And they're balancing having to address a spread of misinformed content from individuals who just have no familiarity with the region or the conflict, but feel compelled to weigh in on. You're balancing trying to deal with graphic imagery and how to make sure that information, as was on the previous panel of conflict, is documented, like, for example, the Bucha massacre perpetrated by Russian soldiers. It's also for average people to look at images of women being dragged streets by Hamas. Hamas attacking kibbutz. And that's, you have to balance that. And then you're also trying to make sure that people are safe and secure. And you are dealing with, a state-sponsored cyber espionage activity, trying to make sure that people can quickly lock down their accounts, and in a region that, has a lot of disputed borders as well. That'd be quite a difficult challenge. And then you're also dealing with the sort of average hate speech and incitement to violence. One interesting example I read recently in Platformer, Casey Newton's publication, was an unlikely platform, Etsy, having to deal with a content moderation decision. I don't know how many of you had a chance to read that, but they banned the term "from the river to the sea" and content on their platform. But as Casey points out in his article, one of the interesting things there is that different platforms have to deal with different content moderation issues differently, because in particular, Etsy is where people do not have as much context, right, as they might in another platform. And so people are printing T-shirts and other material that doesn't include additional context that might exist on a different type of social media platform, where people can explain what they might mean, rather than though controversial, implies incitement to violence against people who currently live between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea. And you're dealing with that, and then in addition to all of it, a sort of perfect storm of hate speech that, as I mentioned, exists both in the region but also all around the world. Last I checked, there was a 500% rise in anti-Semitism around the world since October 7th. And so you're dealing with, trying to not only verify something that's happening on the ground in a conflict, but you're also trying to verify and understand who is painting swastikas on synagogues in Paris. And so OSINT researchers are overstretched because they're not just working on what's happening in region, but also around the world. And, if we're going back to comparing, there were certainly a lot of people who wanted to share their thoughts and ideas about what was happening in Ukraine and about Russia, and even some of the sort of freedom fries things that people were doing, where they were trying to ban Tchaikovsky because of the invasion, things like that. But overall, there wasn't as much of a conversation happening, or even hate speech happening around the world outside of the specific region.
Okay, two things. First of all, good crowd to share this with. One of my former mentors at Columbia Journalism School. This is like 15 years ago now, but he's actually starting a foundation to he's working with a foundation to start a nonprofit to train OSINT researchers and help them distinguish truth from fact, and basically what's already happening in the world, just to provide resources for that. Just a good thing to share for this group, I think. Olga, okay, let's just say we're going to assume, let's just assume in this conversation that there's good faith. But why are these, in your view, why are these mistakes still happening? Like, to Emerson's point, that how can it be that that something as simple as the word Al-Aqsa can be caught up in a classifier, something that we know that tens of millions of people in the region, a term that tens of millions of people in the region use. How does that mistake happen? Assuming good faith.
So I can't speak for, the way an artificial intelligence, automated system might not detect information and content. But that said, you can do a lot of scenario planning. For example, one of my, my former team had a function that was focused on doing threat ideation. And so the way you sort of get ahead of something like that is you maybe think about all the potential scenarios of different terminology being used and misused. And you have to think about that in multiple different languages around the world. And then you have to sort of feed that back into the system. And so there is a lot of work that is done to do that. But of course, with the flood of information that is happening at a time like this, there will be mistakes that are made. I think it's hard to expect, perfect control over information. We can also point to, traditional media, right? Traditional media organizations have made a decent number of mistakes, both in this conflict and in others, when it comes to, making editorial decisions during a time of conflict. And so you talk about major publications like the New York Times having to sort of walk things back, as well as the BBC, because of things are moving quickly, and there are certain problems that they can anticipate and certain ones that they cannot. An interesting, anecdote that's recent. I don't know how many of you guys seen the recent development where a whole bunch of TikTokers are reading Osama bin Laden and saying, "Gotta hand it to him," on TikTok. One interesting media element there was that The Guardian ultimately took down the Osama bin Laden letter that people were reading and pointing to. And so in a way, that was kind of a content moderation decision that was made by, a media organization to remove that content that the TikTokers were reading and sharing. So it was just an interesting development where sort of that content moderation question sort of spills over into a lot of other spaces.
I want to ask, actually, does anybody want to respond to that? Then I have a question about River of the Sea. Go ahead.
Sorry, I just briefly, because Olga, you touched on so many important things that I want to, explain from the the oversight board's perspective. So I have to be honest, we unfortunately, we didn't have to wait for this conflict to unfold to have to make decisions about crisis and conflict. Some of you may be aware there's been an ongoing conflict in Ethiopia. We've had to deal with Azerbaijan and Armenia. Actually, one of our very first cases related to Armenia and Azerbaijan conflict. So I thought it would be important to share some of the reflections and recommendations we've made to the company that we think can help Meta, anticipate better and probably, hopefully, make less mistakes. So, because we still believe that social media during crisis and conflict, just like connectivity, can actually help people exchange critical information, debate important issues, and also learn how to stay safe. So for us at the board, free expression in these circumstances is more than ever important. So that's why we have recommended and we have pushed Meta, as I was saying, to conduct a first ever independent study into its content moderation and potential bias in Israel and Palestine, something that the company did and concluded that they do have an Arabic, a bias against Arabic content, which they are currently working on. We also issued dozens of recommendations to Meta concerning crisis and conflict. We pushed the company to establish something that's been fundamental to us, a crisis policy protocol, which would help the company govern its responses to crisis. I'm very happy to say that Meta has done that, has implemented that crisis protocol and has created this new protocol that articulates all its different policies when it comes to crisis and conflict. We've also told Meta to protect journalists and protect their reporting about dangerous organization and not censor those journalists. We also got the company to commit to develop a process for documenting human rights abuses and preserving graphic content for the purpose of awareness raising, but also for the purpose of international investigations into potential violations of international human rights law. So I wanted to share this to say that, unfortunately, before Ukraine, before the current conflict between Israel and Hamas, there have been many occasions, unfortunately, in which the board was able to share a few recommendations with the company. This message goes out to all the companies. Let's not wait for crisis to unfold to think about infrastructure and to think about protocols that are in place that we can activate as soon as a crisis like this one unfolds. Because unfortunately, when we make decisions hastily, and I can speak to that as a leader of a nonprofit organization that fights to protect free expression, especially in places where there is no infrastructure, where there is no democracy. I mean, we're talking about Israel, which is one of the most democratic countries in the world, okay? They would have infrastructure potentially to face this type of problem. Think about Myanmar, think about Cameroon, where I'm from, think about many places around the world where there is less resources in terms of moderation, but yet the same problems exist and do need responses. So probably using this opportunity of this panel to ask those companies, be prepared, don't wait for the moment to start thinking about processes, but have comprehensive, coherent, and actionable plans and protocols in place to avert and be proactive on this type of issues. Thank you.
Really quickly, I just wanted to step in and flag. There was a report that just came out a couple days ago from the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Researchers like Samantha Lai and Kamya Yadav, Alicia Wanless, and others published a report on, they did a lot of research into crisis response and how it affects the information environment. And they have some specific recommendations in that report on how to, prepare, as Julie's mentioned. And again, there are teams like my team that do things like threat ideation exercises and red teaming to try to anticipate what might happen. But there's some lessons learned, right? There are issues with graphic imagery that have permeated a lot of these conflicts that Julie mentioned, right? Not just Russia's invasion of Ukraine, not just this current conflict, but also all the others that perhaps people haven't paid attention to as much on social media. How many people have been killed in Yemen and some other places around the world that there are a lot of conflicts, unfortunately, all happening concurrently globally.
I want to just ask a few quick questions.
Comment as well.
What? Sorry, did I?
I think Emerson had something to add here as well. So I just
Go
want
ahead,
to
Emerson.
pass the mic.
Sorry, just one more quick point here, because this is such a interesting conversation with these different perspectives. I earlier highlighted some specific technical failings in content moderation systems, but there's a broader point to be made here, which is, my studies of the intersection of conflict and social media, talking to folks on different sides of the issue, it is remarkable how government policymakers and civil society often expect a level of perfection and prescience from technology companies, which they would logically, they'd understand would not be possible if they themselves were, say, passing particular policies. An example here that stands out to me is in the Russian invasion of Ukraine. There was an early Meta announcement that the platform would permit calls to violence against Russians from Ukraine in the context of the war. This was clearly because many Ukrainians were simply writing the Russians when they were talking about the soldiers who were in their streets, who were killing their families. But this reporting around this and discourse around this quickly became an argument that Meta was abetting genocidal language against all Russians everywhere, which of course it was not. That's just an example of how the fog of war and even well-meaning and logical platform interventions can collide to push things in uncertain and confusing directions. And a final note here, though, is in the Russia-Ukraine case, at least for me, there was a presumption that civil society, governments, and technology companies were all acting from a place of good faith. Everyone is trying to do their best to mitigate harm to their users and to real people. In this conflict, I don't think that's the case any longer, not because of Meta, but because of X and Telegram specifically.
I know you're in the middle of conducting a study on a particular social media platform. Can you talk about that?
Well, sure thing. So to elaborate a little bit more, we're conducting studies across the board, including studies of Facebook and Instagram. But I do want to talk a little bit more about the role of X, which Cheyenne also talked about in our first panel. Simply because it's a case of some specific design decisions that were made from the top, specific decisions that Elon Musk proudly announced and instituted in the months before the war, which I think very meaningfully contributed to the misinformation crisis on the platform, and by extension, helped misshape public understanding of the crisis and probably drove war decisions and real policy decisions that have cost lives.
I'm very curious
Specific
what you're
things,
going to say.
sure. Specific things I'd like to highlight are X's approach to verification. It doesn't matter. I mean, it's whatever. The people lost their blue check marks. Who cares about that from like a status perspective or whatever? But where it did matter was that it meant that anyone could buy the appearance of being an established account, maybe an established OSINT aggregator. Someone could buy a blue check mark, get a few followers, put like a nice logo as a profile picture or something, portray themselves as a journalist, and then with the right boosts, all of a sudden be reaching millions of people. So there was a conscious attempt to erase access to reliable information. This was also bound up in the X monetization scheme, which introduced a direct incentive for people to write the most scandalous posts they could to reach as wide an audience as they could. And in fact, in many cases, to not delete information when it was found to be false, because there's at least a perception among many monetized users that if they delete their post, they won't get money for it any longer. So we've tracked cases, for instance, where a video claiming something objectively false might receive millions of shares. Then days or weeks after the fact, a tiny note might be appended at the bottom. This wasn't actually true. And one might say that the community notes feature of X is intended to pick up the slack. But as we've seen numerous times, as was also established in this first panel, community notes is itself just another information battlefield, because it's essentially a crowdsourced fact-checking tool. There are partisans on both sides. It is not a reliable instrument. It's been repeatedly cited as one, but it simply is not. And then finally, and very briefly, the fact that it is so much harder to understand what's going on the platform. Twitter's easily accessible API and the nature of the platform was really at the foundation of the study of social media and political events for over a decade. With the incredibly expensive and still more restrictive API schemes, which X has put in place, it's essentially killed independent research of the platform, perhaps killed as intended. But there was a Reuters report out just last week, which found that over 100 major research projects have had to be canceled or significantly reworked because there's no longer access to that underlying data. So this platform, which is just as important as ever, at least among senior policymakers and journalists, because there's some path dependency there, is now much less accountable, much harder to understand what's going on, and it's had a direct and destructive impact on real people.
And then, thank you. I feel validated because those 3 points were the theses of our Twitter takeover anniversary story that we ran a few weeks ago. And also to add that Elon Musk himself, just last night, he validated, he co-signed an anti-Semitic conspiracy theory, the Great Replacement theory. So you also have his own voice that has grown enormously since he took over the platform, his own megaphone, weighing into this conflict. And early on, remember that he tweeted OSINT researchers, and it turned out to be misinformation. And then he took it down. Now he's tweeting some, extremely anti-Semitic content. And so you have his own figure as a megaphone and as a disinformer that I think also can't be ignored. I have a question for all three of you, which is, Olga, you touched on the phrase "from the river to the sea," and I wanted to ask you all just quickly, because we don't have that much time. In my understanding is Facebook and Instagram allow the phrase. Correct me if I'm wrong. Etsy didn't allow it. For some, it's a call for liberation of Palestine. For other people, it's anti-Semitic, and it's the call for the end of the Israeli state. Where do you all stand on that phrase? Should the platforms allow it? It's probably one of the most evoked phrases during this current conflict.
I'll go ahead first. So I can't speak to Meta's policy. We're currently, as I was saying, exploring taking a case on the issue of Israel and Palestine. And if we did, we will, of course, as usual, ask questions because in our processes, the board is allowed to ask Meta questions. But what I can say with certainty is that, speaking from experience, I probably share a personal experience, understanding that conflict with the help of colleagues who are all located in the region. I'm talking specifically here about my oversight board colleagues who come from Egypt, Jordan, Yemen, Israel. Working in such a diverse environment has been extremely helpful for me to understand the conflict in a less passionate manner and think about expression and free expression foremost. So that's what I can share with certainty, is that we are a group of 22 individuals at the Meta Oversight Board who come with our diverse backgrounds, diverse nationalities, and bring into the conversations about content moderation and human rights. We try to bring in the contextual information that is, frankly, most of the time lacking in the at scale moderation that we're seeing in this conflict, but in general. And so
let me jump in. Sorry, I'm going to be the moderator. But where do you stand personally on it? You don't have to speak for all 22 members of the board, but as a board member, you're going to be weighing in. And I'm curious, where it's probably the most evoked phrase in this conflict, one of them, where do you stand?
My opinion, frankly, is not of interest to anyone here, I think. But as someone who advocates for free expression at Internet Sans Frontières and also at the Oversight Board, I would say that, any restriction of freedom of expression that is not proportionate, that is not legal, that is not necessary, is absolutely unacceptable. So if we came across such restriction when working on a case potentially involving that phrase, but anything else, really, that will be the lens through which I will look at things.
Okay, yeah. Go.
I'm just going to echo what Julie said, which is I'm here to not share my personal opinions on anything, but I'm here to speak as a pervades disinformation and influence, how it manifests in the information environment. So what I'll say is, one of the things I'm a big stickler for is terminology and studying the definitions and meanings of words and what they mean. And, I would go back and point to the original meanings and definitions of words when they were established and, go back and read what they're about. Words change over time. And when it comes to that, I actually would point everyone to a really good piece by Masha Gessen back in 2017 called The Autocrat's Language, which speaks to how, various autocrats and others can do violence to language and change their meaning. I'm always a big stickler for going back to what the original meanings of words and phrases were.
Emerson, what do you think?
So I want to draw a distinction here between, because as Olga said, language is not static, but there's a distinction between when language is used in the context of violence, or if it's used in the context of violence, versus how language makes users feel, even if it's the same language used after a violent event. To dig into that a bit more, when in 2019, there was a massacre of 52 Muslim congregates in Christchurch, New Zealand, that shooter, before his live stream massacre, had scrawled a series of names, but then also far-right memes on his gun before he perpetrated this act of violence. In that case, some of the language and themes that he was evoking, which previously might have been permissible on a platform, I think were suddenly much less so, because this was a clear and direct causal link between certain language and between violence. By contrast, in everything I've seen, the direct link between violence and that phrase is less established in this case. In fact, prior to October 7, the Anti-Defamation League had a different interpretation of that phrase. Moderation of it today still varies by platforms. Etsy took its action because on its products, there was no ability for there to be further context, right? It was simply the slogan itself, a slogan which now many people associate with deadly violence. But on platforms that house political expression, whether that's Facebook or X, I think it's too soon to consider banning such a phrase entirely, because it has had historically so many more uses, and because its explicit link to October 7 is, in my mind, not sufficiently established.
That's fascinating. Thank you. You all know, so I asked the question because it's good to ask a question specifically, because then, you kind of test out where people stand and it gets into the lens with which you look at that. So thank you all for your answers about that. Curious too about content moderators. We haven't talked much. We talked about policy. We haven't talked as much about content moderators. Olga, this is a question for you, and for Julie. Actually, for all three of you, which is how content moderators are in times of crisis. Can you tell us more about how a moderator might be trained once, like, a war breaks out and there's already existing rules because it's a pre-existing conflict, but suddenly a war breaks out? Go into as much detail as possible. Are moderators getting daily reports of new terms? How does the training for moderators change? And are there right now enough moderators to handle a global conflict like this, particularly when the tech companies are cutting staff? And I know there were a lot of cuts to operations, both at Twitter and at Meta.
So as someone who's never trained myself, I'll caveat to say that I am not a professional when it comes to speaking about how to do that content moderation training. That said, a lot of you might be familiar with the publicly stated community standards of social media platforms. And what happens during a time like this is those get changed both publicly as well as internally, right? There is what those rules of the road are. And, as Emerson mentioned, a specific one related to the beginning of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, related to threats of violence against Russian individuals. But there's a number of other examples like that. And so what happens is there are policies that will make changes to the content moderation rule, to the community standards that are public. There's interpretation of those particular policies that are then internal to those teams. So the teams will take a look at those changes to the rules. Sometimes they don't happen, so early, right? There's a lot of established rules that might have their own modification. But what happens is, as I said, sometimes there can be work that's done ahead of time, and as work, because again, this particular conflict can erupt. There are a lot of other similar problems that content moderation challenges that people have had to deal with Nagorno-Karabakh, with Ukraine and Russia, that apply here as well. And then, taking some of those lessons learned and applying them to this particular conflict and to the languages involved. I can't speak to numbers just because I don't know exactly how many people there are, but I will say that I can imagine that, the different social media companies that have, reportedly cut a lot of different operational and trust and safety teams, as well as other teams, are probably hurting. This is no matter how many people you hire, you will never have enough people in the world to deal with the amount of content that is posted on a daily basis, and even more so during a time of conflict. And so I imagine that it is really difficult, not only for the people working on content moderation, but also all the other teams that are working on this. I can say from my own personal experience, prior to any of these layoffs, speaking, you asked us to speak a little bit personally. I'll say that, I didn't really shower properly and brush my hair for the first 2 weeks since Russia invaded Ukraine. And that conflict touched me personally, since my family is originally from Ukraine. And so I didn't even have time to process the personal, emotional side of that. In addition to just doing my job. And, we had fairly robust teams working on that, but there's never going to be enough. It's, you just can't keep up with the amount of content that is produced by people in tons of countries around the world, which is why, there's a lot of research being done, some by DRLab and some by others, on how can we use, whether it's artificial intelligence techniques, as well as other tools, to try to bolster the existing content moderation and policy work that is done at companies. What are some of the offerings that private trust and safety firms can offer to people and to companies to, again, buttress what's already being done? Whether it's, even things like community notes, what are ways in which what can we learn from community notes, or even Wikipedia, when it comes to sort of the community being involved in content moderation? That's a really big question. I think there will never, even if the companies double the amount of people they had right now, it would be really hard for everybody working on that.
Double. Actually, we're actually realizing that we have to get to some audience questions, because there's some great audience questions. So I'm going to dive into those, which is one question, which is, what piece of disinformation has surprised each speaker during this war, and why? And why don't, to get to a few more questions, why don't we just take Emerson? Has there been a piece of disinformation that surprised you?
Yeah, I mean, this is really a pick and choose from a gallery of horrors. The thing that stood out to me most over the first few days, I think, was the imagery of dead children, because there were cases where that this is the broadly known, like a Pallywood conspiracy theory, cases where stills from unrelated film sets would be used to allege the Palestinians were, playing victim when in fact they were alive. Another case where a child's Halloween costume, he was wearing a little ghost sheet, but he was seated on a hospital bed. This had been over not over Halloween. This had been years earlier. Also taken as an example of a fake body. So this is a commonly established narrative, but the specific thing that really struck me and stayed with me was a case where there was an image of a real dead child who looked very doll-like, which was widely broadcast, at least on X, to millions and millions of people, alleging that this image was fake because it looked too much like a doll. So in this case, we had numerous people looking at a real dead child and then alleging something else. So this was just, I think, demonstrating the fact that even when the image is real, even when the context is real, people still approach it having so many existing biases that they can dismiss this evidence before their eyes.
Someone also asked,
Fine.
sorry, it sounds like someone else wants to say what piece of disinformation surprised them.
Yes, I wanted to briefly respond and say that the video game footages on X were absolutely terrible. And I have to say, really, as you know, the director of Internet Sans Frontières was part of the trust and safety network that Twitter had set up, and which was completely which disappeared from one day to another through an email last year. And this for us is extremely worrying and we find it extremely dangerous. I look forward to reading DFR Lab's upcoming report about X and the lack of content moderation. But to your question about generally what we see in terms from the content moderator perspective, I would like to mention briefly that the Oversight Board in many of our decisions, we try to shed light on what are called implementation guidelines, which are internal guidelines that content moderators receive in complement to the public-facing community standards. And what we try to do is to encourage the company as much as possible to have a consistent version of the community standards, which is consistent with the implementation guidelines that the moderators receive. This is not always the case, and we are really pushing the company as much as we can in every policy possible to change that. Another aspect that I wanted to briefly touch upon with regards to moderation is we think at the board that human review is extremely important, especially when it comes to dangerous organizations and individuals. That policy right now is being enforced partly, to be very frank, through automation. And the mere mention of, as I was saying, Taliban or any other group that's forbidden on Facebook and Instagram is being taken down. We think that's not okay. We think, especially in a crisis, that's where the human review is even more important because the consequences can be even more important than in normal situations. And I would like to briefly mention, lastly, that the information we received from Meta is that they set up what they call an IPOC. I'm trying to read exactly as a reminder what that stands for. It stands for Integrity Product Operations Center, which is, I think a cross-functional set of teams working together to try to address and escalate potential problems when it comes to conflict and crisis situations. So, just wanted to flag those three measures. Thank you so much.
Okay. Yeah, of course. So we have 2 more minutes on the panel. So I'm going to get one more question in, and I would just ask the panelists to just keep your answers pretty tight, so we can hew to time. So there was a question about the use of extremely graphic imagery from October 7th and the subsequent Israeli campaign. The person asked, Albert Lee asked, is this considered the next stage of normalization of disseminating such material on social media following the war in Syria and the Russian invasion of Ukraine? Has this crossed a new line in what the public can see and what platforms can permit?
So I can start here. I actually asked this question of the first panel, and we were lucky to feature an Israeli perspective, but it is so important that I think it should be considered here too. I think that there's an unprecedented volume of graphic material. In this case, every combatant, many neutral parties, partisans of all stripes, they all have a common interest in showcasing this graphic content because they're trying to elicit outrage and build sympathy for their perspective. All this is entirely understandable. And it is also important to see the true horrors of war, whether that is what Hamas did on October 7 or the bloody death, which accompanies an IDF airstrike near a Palestinian hospital. But I guess the observation I'd make is that this kind of graphic imagery does have sharply diminishing returns, that The challenge is when everyone uses this material, it becomes almost a sort of arms race of competing tragedy. And as time goes on, continuing use of almost exclusively graphic imagery could in some ways serve to diminish understanding of the suffering in the space, simply because people will be reduced to those bloody images. And I think their actual stories and contexts and lived experiences might become more marginalized. So that's my thoughts there. Thank you.
I'll just add really quickly, I know we're at time, but I mentioned a lot of different trust and safety challenges during time of I think graphic and violent imagery is one of the toughest because it has that duality, which is, we're not, let's set aside images that are not real and not verified, and let's say that everything was real and verified. The other problem that you have is that you are trying to balance a human crises and also at the same time protect people from actually seeing content that is going to be jarring to them, because as many content moderators know, like that, that stays with you for a really long time, or anyone that's worked in, national security spaces and sees that kind of content. And so you have to balance that. And I think, as a society, we have to figure out the right way to do that. We look back to, World War II and some of the images of concentration camps and other things that people saw only after. How do we, handle that tricky balance between those two incentives?
Oh, I hope we are at time. There's two really good questions. Maybe someone could give just like a 30-second answer, just whoever wants to. The first one is the connection to Holocaust denial and people saying that October 7th was fake or a false flag, that worse, that Israel set up the attack. How should platforms moderate that? Anyone can take it 30 seconds. I think it's a really important question.
I can briefly speak to that and say that the board has urged Meta to adopt a clear and human rights-based misinformation policy to state clearly what is their content moderation infrastructure when it comes to addressing misinformation. It was not related to the conflict, I have to be honest, it was related to the COVID-19 pandemic. But I think given the extent of the conflict right now, some of these recommendations could apply to such types of claims.
There is actually a policy against Holocaust denial, which didn't exist some years ago, but does exist now. And so, it's a question of, there's been a lot of questions from the human rights community about which particular conflicts denial of atrocities is considered to be acceptable speech or not. So that's, I think, an open question for human rights advocates.
Thank you, Olga. We actually have a case of Holocaust denial right now pending in front of the board. So we'll have a result of those very soon. Thank you.
This has been so fascinating. I wish that we could get to a lot more questions and even dive in on some of the ones that we're already talking about. But thank you so much for asking me to moderate, Emerson. Thank you, Julie. Thank you, Olga. And thank you to the audience. I'm sorry we couldn't get to more of your questions. There was just a fascinating conversation.